Gaza deportation conversation between Netanyahu and Trump. And I'm just getting started. Keep me company, please, after the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock, the French president has told Parliament the UK and France have a duty to tackle illegal migration. Emmanuel Macron is the first French leader in 17 years to make a state visit to the UK.
Indeed, in this unstable world, hope for a better life elsewhere is legitimate, but we cannot allow our country's rules for taking in people to be flouted and criminal networks to cynically exploit the hopes of so many individuals with so little respect for human life.
He's preparing for a state banquet at Windsor Castle later. The first part of a report into the Horizon IT scandal has found the Post Office knowingly used unjust and flawed prosecutions. The chair says dozens of people contemplated suicide as a result of being accused of wrongdoing. 3 men have been found guilty of an arson attack on a warehouse supplying aid and equipment to Ukraine. The Old Bailey heard they were acting on behalf of the terrorist Wagner group in March last year. And investigators looking into the death of Liverpool footballer Diogo Jota say it's likely his car was significantly speeding. The 28-year-old was killed alongside his brother in a car crash in Spain last week. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 47 points at 88.54. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.15. LBC weather, a few light spots of rain in the northwest tonight, staying clear and dry towards the southeast, a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. President Emmanuel Macron of France. State visit. The King and the other royal cards. Prime Minister. Parliament. But it wasn't the trumpets, and it wasn't the bearskins, and it wasn't the household cavalry. It wasn't even Windsor Castle in the sunshine, or the French flags, or the royal landau with its horses, or all the lesser landaus with their horses, or the kisses, or the speeches, or the glitter of swords, or the clatter of hooves. The politics of this state visit came down to one thing. Below all the ritual razzmatazz, it was about migrants setting out day after day after day in inflatable boats across the English Channel. Would the French at last properly try to stop them? Well, here is President Macron addressing both houses of Parliament in the last hour.
In this unstable world, hope for a better life elsewhere is legitimate, but we cannot allow our country's rules for taking in people to be flouted and criminal networks to cynically exploit the hopes of so many individuals with so little respect for human life. France and the United Kingdom have a shared responsibility to address irregular migration with humanity, solidarity and firmness. The decisions that we will take at our bilateral summit will respond to our aims for cooperation and tangible results on these major issues.
Now, already French police have been wading into the water and using knives to puncture the boats and stop them setting off. But there still hasn't been a proper deal between the two countries. The one on the table is so-called one in, one out. It's a little complicated to explain, and we still don't know whether the French will, after just a few more salutes from cannons and the odd banquet or two, actually sign up. But on this, stopping most of the boats may hang the future of Keir Starmer's government. Let's begin by talking to the former UK Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, John Vine, who explained to me if this one-in, one-out system was introduced, how would it work?
Well, clearly we need the specific proposals, but my understanding is that if there is an asylum seeker in France who has relatives in the UK, a legitimate asylum seeker, then we will exchange that person. We will take somebody from France into this country, and we'll give them in return somebody who's paid a smuggler to put them on a boat and get them across the channel.
Some people listening will say, well, how does that make things better? It's still the same number of people. One in, one out means the same number. But I guess the idea is to act as a deterrence to people who have no connections here trying to come across the channel because they'll be sent back to France.
Yes, this would be a first in a way, because up until now France has resisted any attempts by the British government to have an arrangement whereby people are returned from the shores of the UK back to France. So this is establishing a principle, but in a very limited way and with specific people in mind. And one wonders whether the scale of it, depending on what's being announced, is going to be sufficient to provide the deterrent that the government thinks will be made.
But this is the kind of scheme the Conservatives would like to have done and were unable to do at that period. So in a sense, it's a bit of a coup for the government, even if, as you say, it's quite small scale.
Yeah, I think potentially it's a step in the right direction. And, if that principle can be established, then, of course, and a small scheme is shown to work, at least in limited part, one never knows what the impact on people who, of course, are handing over their life savings to organised crime, it might have. They might say, well, if there's even the smallest chance of being returned to France and really not getting any benefit from all that money they've paid to organised crime, then perhaps that will send a message to others not to bother.
It seems to me to be organisationally quite a hard thing to do, to be able to identify asylum seekers in France with genuine family connections and then swap them and the rest. Do you think the border force is frankly big enough up to doing this?
Well, the Home Office, of course, has always not been a ring-fenced department when it comes to savings in government. They've always had to make economies, particularly, and Border Force has taken its share of that. So they'll have to work with France to identify the right people, and they'll obviously use biometric identity methods to verify their identity and make sure they have relatives in the UK. They'll have to have a process whereby, I would imagine, Border Force civil servants will have to go to France and work with the French. But exactly how it will work remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen. And of course, there are quite a lot of other European countries, Spain, Portugal, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, possibly Greece, who hate this idea and have written to the European Commission, I think, complaining that the French are doing a deal with the British on this. Can you again explain to people listening why other European countries wouldn't like it?
Yeah, well, they're on the fringes of the European Union, those countries. And, of course, do you remember the Dublin Agreement? When we were part of the European Union, we had the Dublin Agreement, which meant that people who actually were deported from countries like the UK and France could be sent back to the country they arrived at when they entered the European Union. And those countries are on the borders of the European Union. So in Spain, they have a lot of migrants sailing over the Med from North Africa. In Italy and Malta, of course, from the Middle East. And so they're afraid that, of course, the French will perhaps deport them from France back to the country of origin, and that'll be those countries in that list you've mentioned.
I see. So it's not we take in one person and send one person back to France. We might be, in fact, sending one person back to Spain or to Greece or to Italy.
That's right. I mean, there's no guarantee that the French are going to keep hold of them and keep them in France. So I think that's why they're very concerned about this. And it breaches some rules that exist within the European Union at the moment.
Last question. We've all seen some videos of French police wading into the sea and using knives to puncture the inflatables used by the smugglers.
Yes.
One wonders why this hasn't happened before, but do you think this is something that's going to happen more generally, and might that have an effect?
Well, I think you have to remember that, of course, the police service in France is highly unionised. And I think the unions have been very concerned about the safety of officers. Many of those officers carry lots of kit, including weapons, unlike our own officers. And I think they've been concerned that they shouldn't get involved in trying to rescue people from the sea. At the same time, I think, standing on the beach and watching people potentially drown isn't really what a police officer's job is. You're supposed to save life and protect property. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but it is fraught with danger. First of all, if it's going to have any impact, it needs to be more widespread than one or two incidents. So it'll be interesting to see whether all the police interaction, results in, for example, a boat being punctured. But it's also fraught with difficulty in that, of course, somebody can drown. And if somebody drowns, it'll be interesting to see whether the governments and politicians stand by police officers who behave in this way. I'm sure the police themselves will be looking for that, looking for assurances that they'll have top cover if it goes slightly wrong.
Of course they will. Big challenges for the French police ahead, and big challenges for the two political teams this week. John Vine, thank you very much for talking to LBC. And now to a shrewd observer who was in Parliament while the French president was giving his address, Sophie Pedder, the Paris bureau chief for The Economist. Sophie, thanks so much for coming in. Listening to John Vine there, it seems to me it's going to be quite hard for President Macron to concede what Keir Starmer wants on this one-in, one-out deal.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, clearly this afternoon, Macron said in Parliament he wants to fix this problem and to share the problem with the UK. So he does want to try and find a solution to this. But that particular solution, it maybe he'll manage to come to an agreement on Thursday at the summit, but it's going to be very difficult for him. Why? Because of the reasons that your interviewee just raised. That is to say that in France, it's not a bilateral issue. France is part of the European Union, and therefore anyone that's taken in, France has got to decide what to do and whether or not to return them to the country they originally came from. So it's huge pressure from Italy, from Spain in particular, not to start doing these kind of bilateral deals. That's the real difficulty for him. So he's under a lot of pressure himself.
Some very, very hard negotiating to go ahead. Also, I'm sure in private, one of the conversations that Keir Starmer will want to have is about this puncturing of boats, because it's fairly dramatic, the pictures. And you kind of think, everybody is at that point sort of in thigh-high water. They're not in deep water. And so why can't this be done more often?
The thing is that the French operate under rules that have been set in France by the Interior Ministry, and those rules don't allow them to wander into the water and to rescue people once they've set off from the shore, or at least not into very deep water. Now, there is a sense of a kind of review of this going on in the French government. They are beginning to look at whether or not they will change the rules. They're sort of testing it a little bit in certain parts of the northern French coast. We've seen those pictures, but it would involve a change of the rules. And that is something that I think the French probably are ready to contemplate doing, despite it being, again, difficult, but even politically for them to do that. It's even more difficult to have them watching as people set off and into danger.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. All the grandeur, there is the President of the French Republic and the music behind him, and it's fantastic. But actually, Emmanuel Macron himself is not in a terribly strong political position, is he? He has to be gone in, about 2 years' time? That's when his term ends. And he's under a lot of pressure, both from the left and the right, and he's lost his majority in the National Assembly. Just talk us through where he is now.
Well, he runs a minority government. Government is split three ways, so it's a complete deadlock in Parliament. Almost anything they try to get through, including the budget for this year, is just meets obstruction from one side or the other. So it's a three-way deadlock, and that makes it very difficult for him. He's on his third prime minister since last July.
This all sounds horribly familiar, I have to say. This side of it.
It does remind us a little bit of those bad years for the UK. I mean, UK looks relatively stable, even if Keir Starmer's got his own problems. He's at least got a majority. Macron doesn't have that. He's got two more years to serve. The next French presidential election isn't until 2027. And one of the reasons I think he's spending so much time abroad doing international foreign affairs is precisely to sort of get away from this paralysis at home, which is not a great situation for him.
Final question. I know that Keir Starmer is rather proud of the personal relationship he has forged with President Macron. He thinks they're getting on really, really well. But who do you think he's going to have to forge a personal relationship with next? Is it possibly going to be Marine Le Pen?
Well, the courts are going to decide that because Marine Le Pen has currently been banned from running for office for 5 years, and she's appealed for that. We'll hear the result from the Court of Appeal next summer. If they uphold her conviction and the sentencing they've handed down to her, she won't be running for the presidency in 2027, and then everything is open. It could be her sort of second, who's called Jordan Bardella, who's a very young guy. He's barely 30.
Young. He's tiny. Yeah.
He's a tall guy.
Sorry, tiny in terms of age, yes. Yeah.
So at the moment, we're waiting on the court case. It is if Marine Le Pen can run, she's got a chance of becoming the next president of France. If she's ruled out, then that's the end of her political career.
Sophie, I said you were a shrewd observer, and so you are. Thank you very, very much for that indeed. Now then, coming up, in spite of a 22% pay rise awarded last year, resident doctors have once again voted to go on strike. Why? We'll find out next, but the time now, 6:15.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
So we don't know how many and we don't know the cost.
Straight to the point.
Tell you what they're laughing at, those two. They're laughing at the law, and we're letting them.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Inexcusable, shambolic failure.
Listen on Global Player or the new LBC app. Download it now from your app store. LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
Now, I believe that the resident doctors, we used to call them junior doctors, deserve more pay than they're getting at the moment. Vital job, long training, hard hours. But as they vote to strike over pay yet again, they are taking the NHS and the Labour government that backs it into incredibly dangerous territory. Wes Streeting gave them a 22% pay rise after Labour won power and a top-up this year of 5.4%, well above inflation and the highest pay award in the public sector. The BMA calls all of that derisory and wants a 29% increase over the next few years to make up for hard times under the Tories. Meanwhile, all around this country, workers doing other important jobs have had pay rises of below inflation, and the government has rarely had so little cash. The Office of Budget Responsibility today used the word vulnerable about the state of Britain's finances. If that 29% was awarded, public sector workers everywhere would want the same. I'm sorry, chaos. The end of the Starmer government, perhaps, as an effective governing force. Labour had been making progress on NHS waiting lists at a time when public satisfaction with the NHS is close to an all-time low. Forget that. So this challenge comes at a moment of great fragility and great peril. I think we are closer to the end of the NHS as we have known it than perhaps the doctors' leaders realise. Here's the BMA speaking to Sheila Fogarty this afternoon.
We needed to see further progress towards restoring our pay. We're 12 months on from that deal now, and We wanted to see a commitment to ongoing pay restoration to reverse those 17 years of real terms pay cuts.
And he hasn't given you that commitment, because in public he has, that he will continue to talk to you and try to work it out. But that's it hasn't been sufficient, no?
No, there's no commitment to full pay restoration and to restoring all of our pay. But we want to work collaboratively with the government. We want to meet with them. We want to come to the table. We want to work together like we did last time. We showed, 12 months ago that we can work quickly to achieve a deal. Let's do the same again.
So to react to this, I'm joined now in the studio by Sir John Oldham, Senior Advisor to Wes Streeting on primary care and neighbourhood health, and he is a GP by background. Do you think the government could possibly give the BMA what they're asking for at the moment, John?
No, not at all. We are in the economic equivalent of the COVID crisis in the NHS. It's existential, truly is. And I think the decision today is just sad for patients and sad for the NHS. I was a GP for 29 years. I've worked with 13 Secretaries of State one way or another. But as a clinician, it's a privilege to do that job. And we should put the care of people before the care for ourselves. I, as a junior doctor, did a 1 in 2 on call. That's every other night and the days in between. It was terrible. But our representatives worked to change that. I would never at any time have thought of taking industrial action.
In previous bouts of industrial action, there's been a lot of public support for what were then called junior doctors. Do you think that is beginning to evaporate?
I would say to the public, this time round, you should not support the junior doctors. 20-odd% increase, many people would dream for that. And yes, I understand there are other issues around training and the way they work in hospitals and getting allocated places and having proper food and drinking in the evening. But they should read the 10-year plan, because in that is a commitment to urgently deal with those very issues. So I don't quite understand why they're making this move. It's the industrial relations equivalent to me of the charge of the Light Brigade.
So, John, I said in my introduction, maybe I was being a little over the top, that I thought the NHS, as we have come to know it, is in real peril at the moment. In other words, if these reforms can't work, if Wes Streeting can't make the reforms he's committed to, that could be it. We could get a different government, we could get a totally different system. And I don't get the sense, perhaps, that the BMA fully understands the scale of the crisis.
I think you are right and they are wrong. And I've been around doing this stuff for a very long time. I now regard it as the most challenging time for the NHS. If the reform doesn't work this time round, then I do think that the NHS is in serious trouble as we know it. So I would say to the junior doctors, support the NHS, not your leadership. I'd say to the public, support the NHS and don't support the resident doctors in this action.
As you say, a very, very sad moment. And this is a period where actually, in terms of all the promises the Labour government made at the election, they are beginning to tick off some of those big waiting list problems. It is beginning to turn, very slowly, but it's beginning to turn.
Things are turning, and also the wide engagement for the 10-year plan, and a plan's a plan, but I can tell you that the shift now to implement these changes and to get things done, and I expect you will hear announcements pretty soon around some of this, is people are completely focused because we believe in the NHS and we believe in actually maximising the care for people, which at the moment we don't have. But this action, they really should examine their consciences and remember the spirit of the Hippocratic Oath.
There's a very, very serious message to the BMA. Sir John Oldham, thank you so much for coming in and talking to me. The post office scandal has been one of our worst, and today we learned just how bad. As his 162-page report was published, Sir Win Williams, the chairman of the public inquiry, said that according to their families, 13 sub-postmasters had killed themselves because of wrongful accusations and convictions. Another 59 had contemplated suicide and 10 had attempted it. The scandal was caused by faulty Fujitsu software wrongly showing shortfalls on their accounts. Post office bosses knew the Horizon software was faulty. Surely prosecutions must follow, but meanwhile, let's hear from Seema Misra, a sub-post mistress who was wrongly jailed while she was pregnant, and Carl Flinders, the chief reporter at Computer Weekly, where he helped expose the post office scandal back in 2009. Seema, let's start with you. What was your reaction to what you've heard today, especially in terms of the personal toll this took on people like you and yourself?
The whole report itself is very thoughtful. Definitely the inquiry team has put a lot of effort in there with lots of suggestion. So yeah, it's really good suggestion, but now it's the government to put a time and implement that.
Absolutely. I think there's going to be a second report which will, as it were, point the finger of blame, and then there may well be police prosecutions of those responsible. But it's been pointed out today it's not just those poor people who killed themselves and their families. There's been an enormous mental stress. People's lives have been turned upside down. People have lost everything. In terms of what happened to you, just remind people listening what the story was.
Yeah, in 2010, I lost the case. I pleaded not guilty for theft charges, but the jury came back with a verdict guilty. So in 2010, on my eldest son's 10th birthday and being 8 weeks pregnant, I was sentenced for 15 months imprisonment. So if I would have been pregnant, I would have been number 14 who committed suicide. So yeah, definitely, if I would have been pregnant, I would have killed myself.
You felt that desolate, that desperate?
Definitely, yeah. It's just like till now, I still can't come in terms with the imprisonment bit.
And was that because of the sort of shame and the sense that nobody would believe you? You knew you hadn't done anything wrong, but the world out there was pointing its finger.
Correct, yeah. It's just the imprisonment, like going to imprison, it's just like bringing shame to family. So I didn't want that to pass on to my family. So I just wanted to kill myself so nobody see me ever again. But I was pregnant. I can kill myself, but not the life inside me.
Indeed, and what an awful place to be at. And can I ask where you've got to now with your family? Are you now in a better place? Do you feel vindication? Do you feel not happiness, but some sense of justice being felt at last?
It's a way to go, but definitely going in the right direction. Definitely is the right direction, but there's still way to go. We didn't expect it this long, but it's going in the right direction.
There's the second part of the report, but what do you want now? What would mean closure for you?
Closure will be the full accountability. So I was sent to the prison for the crime I never committed, but crime did happen. We have an actual culprit roaming around freely. So I think some closure will be when the actual culprits go behind the bar. That could be some sort of closure.
Criminal charges. Seema, thank you very, very much for talking to you, and many commiserations for what you went through. Let's talk now to Carl Flinders, because Carl, you were one of the very first people to start to put your finger on this huge scandal. I'm sure you've had a chance to look at the report and read it, and with all your background, do you think this is a good assessment of the damage that was done by this terrible scandal?
Well, I obviously haven't read the full report yet. I was trying to write a story this morning, but obviously Win Williams is very calm in how he's written it. So I expected maybe more colourful language about the suffering, but and I think the report is dominated by the compensation problems, which it shouldn't be. They should be sorted out by now. I mean, there was a court case in 2018-19 which the post office lost. I mean, that's 7 years ago, and still people in that case haven't been compensated properly. So I think that for me, all I could read about was compensation. I thought
it's been agonisingly slow, Carl. But one of the things that struck me was, I'm sure that when all of this started, when it became a big national story, we thought we were talking about up to 900 postmasters, sub-postmasters, sub-postmistresses caught up by this. It now seems to be a much, much bigger number than that, well over 1,000.
Well, you're talking about prosecutions.
Yes, 10,000, sorry, not 1,000.
Yeah, well, 900 is the figure for people who were prosecuted. I think there's about 730 were prosecuted by the Post Office, and there's a couple hundred by the DWP. So, I mean, there was always a lot more involved than that. I mean, there was always thousands who didn't even know they were involved. I mean, they were always going to come out.
It just seems to be a much bigger story even than we thought at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it just got bigger and bigger. I mean, you could tell in 2015 because the Post Office was trying to cover things up that it was going to be big. Obviously, the drama got the politicians involved, and people have now learned about it. I mean, it's amazing how many people didn't know it was going on, even people who were sub-postmasters. But then, obviously, the drama brought them out, and you can imagine there must be loads of people that had losses that didn't know why they were caused. Maybe it wasn't enough to put them out of business or to change their lives, but still the businesses were struggling because of these errors.
Yeah, an astonishing story, and as Seema was saying, it's going to have to end up in court for those responsible for covering up these terrible failures by the Fujitsu software. Carl, thank you very, very much indeed for that. Up next, Benjamin Netanyahu says he has nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. But with the Israeli Defense Minister revealing extremely hardline plans for the displacement of Palestinians, are we really any closer to any kind of peace in Gaza? More on that in a few moments, but the time now, 6:30, and Amelia Cox has her news headlines.
Emmanuel Macron has addressed Parliament as the first French leader in 17 years to make a state visit to the UK. The French president says the UK must tackle illegal migration with humanity, solidarity and firmness. The chair of the inquiry into the Southport stabbings last summer has described it as one of the most egregious crimes in our country's history. Sir Adrian Fulford says it will identify changes urgently needed to protect the most vulnerable from other horrors. And a senior advisor to the Health Secretary has told LBC the NHS is in the economic equivalent of the COVID crisis, calling it existential. Speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr, GP Sir John Oldham says the government is not in a position to give resident doctors the pay rise they want. LBC weather, a few light spots of rain in the northwest tonight, staying clear and dry towards the southeast, a low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC.
Bye.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:32. It's a kind of quid pro quo. Benjamin Netanyahu, currently at the White House, is nominating Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. In return, Trump is backing the Netanyahu plan to remove Palestinians from Gaza by persuading other Arab countries to offer them a better life. The two men have been discussing a 60-day ceasefire under which Hamas would release the last living hostages in exchange for Israeli troops withdrawing to a buffer zone. Netanyahu is also planning a massive security camp for 600,000 displaced Palestinians who'd be screened and then not allowed to leave until his giant immigration plan gets going. A humanitarian vision or a crime? Let's talk now to Ehud Olmert, former Israeli Prime Minister. Mr. Olmert, thank you very much for talking to us tonight. This discussion in the White House, however surreal, suggests that your vision and other people's vision for a two-state solution and a Palestinian state is, as far as Mr. Netanyahu is concerned, absolutely dead.
It's not dead. It was never alive, as far as Netanyahu is concerned. He and his cabinet are against it. As you can understand from the statements made by his Minister of Defense now, suggesting to deport 600,000 of the Gazans into a remote place near Rafah. They have other ideas about Gaza, none of which may be part of a peace process, but rather deportation and clearing part of Gaza so that perhaps they will be able to establish new settlements. I don't know, but definitely nothing close to thinking about two states.
Indeed. Indeed, he really seem to want to remove all Palestinian Arabs out of Gaza if he possibly can. Do you understand at this point which countries around the Arab world might conceivably take them? Because there seems to be no indication that anyone wants to be involved in this.
None. There's no question. None.
So it's a fantasy.
Each one, yeah, it's an absolute fantasy. I think that President Trump said something about deportation a while ago. I think he forgot it long ago that he ever mentioned it. In fact, in the last couple of days, I heard very encouraging statements made by him talking about the suffering of the Gazans and the need to try and take care of their humanitarian needs, which I loved very much because I think this is what needs to be done. But the Minister of Defense and Netanyahu and his bunch of thugs which are running the cabinet, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the others, they have different ideas.
So the phrase, satire has gone to die is heard from time to time. But what did you make of that exchange where Netanyahu said that he was going to nominate President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, and Trump said, well, I'm going to back your plan for the displacement of the Gazan people? Absolutely astonishing.
It's so sad. Otherwise, it could have been so funny because, on the one hand, Netanyahu can, I think, be very useful in making Trump a serious candidate for peace if he will agree to move forward into negotiations with the Palestinians towards a two-state solution. And then maybe his recommendation would have been received in a serious manner by the committee. I doubt whether a recommendation of Benjamin Netanyahu for a Nobel Prize for Peace is what can be very helpful to Trump to be accepted. But
I don't think
this is their business. I'm not part of it.
I think you're absolutely right. I get the sense at the moment that after the attacks on Iran and the success of those, at least for the time being, and America's involvement, there is absolutely no American pressure really on Benjamin Netanyahu anymore, if there ever was under Donald Trump.
I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not familiar. I'm not privy to any possible source of information that could tell me. The only thing that I ask myself is I'm trying to understand President Trump. If he's really serious in trying to project an image of a peacemaker, and if he really cares for the hostages, and I think he does, by the way. I think he does. You have to give him that credit. He helped release some of them at an earlier stage, and then he was helpful in releasing another American-born hostage. And I think he really cares. But the only way, you don't need to know the facts. You don't need to know all the details. It's very simple. Do you imagine Hamas holding the hostages, releasing them for nothing else than end of the war? I mean, it's inconceivable. They are murderers, they are killers, they are atrocious. Every one of them should have been punished in the most devastating manner. Okay, but they are not dumps. They are not going to release the only asset that they hold for nothing less than what possibly can keep them somehow alive. Therefore, there is only one way to release the hostages, which is a permanent ceasefire or a long ceasefire like Tahdiya, something that is traditional in the frame of mind of the Hamas that they can agree to. But and that is what Netanyahu not prepared to do, because he is captive by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and he will not do anything that can jeopardize the stability of his government. Yeah. So I don't care about you. I don't know all the details. I understand the basic parameters of what's going on here, and therefore, unless there will be a consent about ending the war, there will not be an agreement. And the only person that can force an end to the war is Donald Trump. If he will do it, and if this will be part of a strategy that will then also bring in to Gaza an interim security force made of Palestinians and Arab armies, Egyptians and Jordanians and Emiratis and Saudis and Bahrainis and others, to make sure that Hamas is not resurrected, and then he forces Netanyahu to start negotiations on peace, then he will get a peace prize and we will get peace, which is what we need.
Well, we all need optimism, but I have to say, Mr. Olmert, listening to that conversation in the White House, I just don't believe that President Trump has it in him to do what you say quite rightly absolutely needs to be done. But it was a great privilege having this conversation. Thank you very, very much for talking to me. Now, there are two big issues facing the Prime Minister, I think, today: managing Emmanuel Macron's state visit and trying to get that migration deal over the line, and the strikes voted for by resident doctors we were talking about a little bit earlier. The NHS could face 6 months of strikes and disruptions, and Downing Street says that pay negotiations will not be reopened because the government can't be more generous than it has been already this year. Our political correspondent, Aggie Chambray, is here to tell us more. Fair to say there is real anxiety and tension around the doctors' issue in Downing Street?
I think that's completely fair to say. I mean, speaking to people in government, it sounds like they believe the stakes on this really couldn't be higher. And you spoke to Sir John Oldham about this a little earlier in the programme. But they fundamentally believe that if this government fails to turn around the NHS, there is not much hope, in their words, of them winning the next election. They feel the NHS is something that is so critical to them doing well at the next general election. Then, if you look at the polling, Reform UK will probably then win the next election. This is kind of the thinking goes. And then there's the question mark over what happens to the NHS if Reform UK were in government. Now, Nigel Farage had said the NHS isn't working anymore. We need to fundamentally rethink the way we fund and organise the NHS. He has repeatedly said, though, it will remain free at the point of use. But I think this Labour government are potentially going to try and use scare tactics to basically point to the fact that they think it is so problematic if these strikes go ahead. They have said,
go ahead and break the NHS if you want.
Well, indeed. And they have said, look, we just cannot negotiate on pay, partly because if you start negotiating on pay with the junior doctors, who they point to the fact they've had a 28.9% pay rise compared to 3 years ago, what happens to other public sector people in the public sector, for example, nurses, for example, consultants, and then they might potentially go out on strike, and you can see that is really difficult.
And at that point, as I was saying earlier on, the government appears to have completely lost control. We're back into the worst of the 1970s in terms of the politics of it. One final quick question, however: what about this deal, this one in, one out deal? Talking to our guests earlier on, I think it's going to be a very, very hard thing for Macron to offer Starmer. How high are the hopes in Number 10 about this? What's the optimism level?
I think there's a reasonable amount of optimism, but I think it really depends how the next few days pan out, and it might not happen, and that would be pretty embarrassing considering the briefing that has happened around that. So I think fingers crossed in government, but definitely a bit of a TBC.
All right, Aggie Chambray, thank you very much indeed for helping me out with all of that. Coming up, I'm going to be joined by Harvey Weinstein's former personal assistant and a prominent Labour backbencher, former minister, who've teamed up to ban NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, being used to cover up sexual misconduct in the workplace. But the time now, 6:43.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Resident doctors have voted to go on strike over their 29.2% pay claim. Is this a reasonable demand or something the government should resist?
Ian Dale on LBC. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:45. End of an era. Bosses are to be banned from using non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, to shut people up who've worked for them but who've suffered harassment or discrimination. An amendment to the Employment Rights Bill in the Commons now prohibits legally enforceable NDAs to conceal bad behaviour in the workplace. This isn't just about famous Me Too cases and glamorous people, but it's about everyday discrimination all around Britain. Some say it intrudes too much into daily working life, but how do you ever change attitudes if you don't? Anyway, I'm joined now by the former Transport Secretary, Labour MP, Louise Hay, and by Zelda Perkins, who was the former PA to Harvey Weinstein and ran the group Can't Buy My Silence. Her story began right at the beginning of the Me Too movement, but all these years later, how significant did she think this day was in particular?
Today is huge. And if the government actually can stand by its intentions with this amendment, the UK will be leading globally, which is extraordinary considering, I've been fighting for 7 years and the steps have been, 1 forward, 3 back, 1 forward, 3 back. And I'm still actually slightly in shock and disbelief because this is such an ambitious amendment that will protect across the board in a way that I could never imagine would happen.
A very, very big congratulations to you. Just remind people listening why you've been fighting all this time. You were PA to Harvey Weinstein.
Yes, I was PA to Harvey Weinstein. And obviously in 2017, when allegations started coming out, I decided to break an NDA that I had had, a particularly egregious NDA, which I had had with Weinstein, who had assaulted my assistant. And I felt that it was incredibly important that people understood that they were slightly being distracted by the issue of one man's appalling behaviour, and that the real key to this was the system, and this is the abuse of the system, that those in power and those with money have the ability to buy justice, to buy silence, to abuse with total impunity, and this is protected by the law and protected by, upstanding law providers.
So as you started on this journey, you became aware of more and more cases of people being horribly abused or bullied or whatever, and this being kept secret from the public because of the NDAs.
Yes, and because of the nature of NDAs, there really wasn't any light shone on this, and it's been shocking, the revelations that have come forward. And I mean, I'm still approached by people every day.
So sorry, do people come to you saying, I did sign an NDA, but what I really want to tell you, Zelda, is what happened to me, kind of thing?
It's more about the process of signing an NDA and then the damage, the catastrophic damage that having a sort of basic human right of your voice taken away, which a lot of people don't understand or realise the impact that's going to have when they sign an agreement. I think the other important thing to remember is that when you look at a case like mine, which obviously piques interest in the public because it's a celebrity, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The abuse of power is whether you work at McDonald's, whether wherever you work. And actually, you're more vulnerable if you're a low-paid worker. You have less access to justice. And your settlements are generally tiny. We're talking about hundreds of pounds and maybe a few £1,000s at most. They're not the huge sums that, people at the other end get.
And Louise, I guess millions of people have signed these non-disclosure agreements and, they sign in optimism. It's the beginning of a new job. It's the beginning of something great. And they look back very often in anger and disbelief.
Absolutely. And that point that Zelda just made around the high-profile cases being the ones that most people understand, I think most people would assume that they are constrained to just a few very rare cases in the media or the entertainment industry, when in fact in hospitality and retail they are absolutely widespread. And research led by Zelda's organisation has shown that in 100% of hospitality settlements they have abused confidentiality clauses or NDAs. And these are workers that are very, very vulnerable. So whether you've been sexually assaulted by your boss at work or maybe by a customer and then receive a settlement of hundreds of pounds, we've seen cases where women are then unable to even speak to medical professionals, let alone their friends and family, and therefore are completely unable to recover from that trauma. I broke an NDA a few months ago in Parliament on behalf of a journalist at ITN who'd been the victim of disability discrimination. Because of his NDA, he's unable to explain to any future employer why he left his previous workplace. And so he's not been able to go back to work again. He lost his home. The settlement he received barely covered his legal costs. It destroys lives. And it also allows organisations to turn a blind eye to their wrongdoing, whether it be at a systemic level, whether it be individuals that are being allowed to get away with it throughout the organisation. So today's announcement is a huge step in the right direction for victims and survivors, but also for workplace and organisational culture and transparency.
And no question, but this amendment will go through and it will become law.
So it's been tabled last night in the House of Lords. We had a lot of support in the House of Lords from all parties, so I don't see any problem at all with it getting through the House of Lords, and then the bill will receive royal assent in September. There's then a bit of a question, and Zelda and I are still very aware that there's a bit of fight over the detail to come over some certain points in the law, but today is a huge step forward, and credit to Zelda and all the countless other survivors and victims that have spoken truth to power and risked a huge amount of personal consequence in breaking their NDAs and bringing this issue to light.
A question really to both of you. Some people listening will think NDA, non-disclosure agreement, it all sounds pretty technical, but do you both believe this is actually going to change behaviour in hundreds, perhaps thousands of workplaces all around the country forever?
Absolutely, and I think actually this is a really good point. So I think a lot of businesses will be quite alarmed by this initially, and I think what we've got fantastic data that we've collected from America particularly, where non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality clauses around sexual harassment have been banned in over 27 states. And a lot of companies and lawyers think that if you take away that confidentiality, people won't settle. And the figures are showing this, that actually settlement has gone up by nearly 10%. And that shows that actually the chilling factor was the confidentiality. And the other point is for businesses is that taking away this mechanism will actually modify people's behaviour at root, rather than people believing that they can behave in certain ways and get away with it because there is a mechanism to hide behind.
That's a really, really important point, a very, very big day. While I've got you here, Louise, you're quite rare in having been in the Starmer cabinet, now you're a backbencher. It's been said by a lot of people, I think including me, that relations between the centre, or number 10 as it were, and Labour backbenchers have been really too poor recently. What's your perspective on that? Do you think you're listened to enough?
I think the recent crisis. I don't think it's an overstatement to describe it as that. Over the welfare bill did bring those issues to a head, and I was one of the signatories to the reasoned amendment at second reading of the welfare bill, and that was brought about because there was deep frustration across the Parliamentary Labour Party, not just that the centre wasn't working collegiately with the rest of the Parliamentary Labour Party, but that it wasn't listening to lots of concerns, particularly from disabled people's organisations and wider stakeholders. It was really welcome, though, to see the government take account of that, albeit at that late stage, and make really significant changes to the bill as it went through. And we'll see the remaining stages of that being debated tomorrow. So I'm really hopeful that collectively we can learn lessons from that.
I don't know how many of those have signed an NDA, but are you of the belief there's a kind of slightly swaggering, occasionally bullying, boyish atmosphere going on in Downing Street?
Well, I've spoken previously about the briefings that emanate from the centre, particularly against my former cabinet colleagues that are primarily northern working class women, and those briefings are directed at those women that I perceive, and I'm sure most of the country would agree, have got their head down and are doing a really good job. So I think there is undoubtedly an issue around misogynistic and sexist briefings and attitudes, and that really needs to be stamped down on. It's really disappointing to see that continue, and for people to remain in their posts when they're so brazenly doing it.
One final political question, because you've spoken up, as it were, from the soft left, it's called, of the party. We've had Neil Kinnock, Lord Kinnock, saying this week that he thinks it's time to think about a wealth tax. Would you agree?
Well, firstly, I really hate the term soft left. I think most people would know there's not very much that's soft about me.
Floppy left.
But yeah, I mean, after the local elections, I spoke out and said we need to reconsider these self-imposed tax rules, and I don't think there are many other options ahead of the budget. We can't countenance further public spending cuts, and we can't keep lurching from one crisis to the next, like with the welfare cuts and the winter fuel payments. So I really hope the Chancellor is considering as many creative solutions as possible as we look towards the budget.
Fingers and toes crossed. Louise Hayes, Zelda Perkins, thank you both very much indeed.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
3 men have been found guilty of an arson attack on a warehouse on behalf of the terrorist Wagner group. The building was being used to supply humanitarian aid and Starlink satellite equipment to Ukraine. LBC's reporter Helen Hodinot has been following the story for us. Helen.
So, Andrew, the 3 men found guilty today join 2 others, 20-year-old Dylan Earle from Elmsthorpe in Leicester and 23-year-old Jake Reeves from Croydon, who had already admitted aggravated arson on behalf of the Russian Wagner group, which the UK government has prescribed as a terrorist organisation. The court heard the defendants caused around £1 million worth of damage in the attack on a warehouse in East London in March last year, with the warehouse being targeted because it shipped humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including Starlink satellite equipment, which is crucial for Ukrainian troops. Now, this group was made up of young British men, 3 23-year-olds and 2 20-year-olds. They were told to watch the drama The Americans, which is about KGB. Really? by their contact in Russia. It's about KGB agents posing as Americans in Washington, D.C. to spy on the American government and use it as a sort of manual for their mission here. Now, one live streamed the attack on the warehouse on his phone. Another dropped a large Rambo knife at the scene with his DNA on it. And they went on to plot but not carry out more arson attacks in a restaurant in Mayfair.
So not very sophisticated, this trio.
It could be argued that they made some mistakes along the way, which led to an evidence trail, which led to their conviction. Now, it is a remarkable case because it is the first to result in convictions of British criminals acting as proxies for the proscribed Wagner group under the National Security Act, which was passed by Parliament in 2023. And that was put in place to deal with the increased risk of hostile state activity here in the UK. Commander Dominic Murphy is the head of the Met's counter-terrorism unit, and he told me more than a fifth of their work is now dealing with plots by hostile states, and they're using simple tactics to lure potential recruits.
Well, in this case, recruited online, and the motivation appears for the majority of the case to have been money. It's increasingly an issue for us, not just Russia, of course. We have other countries that we are concerned about too, and we've disrupted a number of those. But Russia are particularly active here in the United Kingdom.
And that's exactly what the head of MI5 was warning about in his speech late last year. So a really, really big moment for the security services. Now, today, resident doctors voted to strike again after a 22% pay rise last year. Earlier in the programme, I spoke to Sir John Oldham, who's senior advisor to Wes Streeting on primary care and neighbourhood health, about the decision to strike again.
We are in the economic equivalent of the COVID crisis in the NHS. It's existential, truly is. And I think the decision today is just sad.
Well, I will be back with you tomorrow. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order you'd like them, you can pause, you can rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts. Download the official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. Resident doctors have voted by 90% to 10% to go on strike over their 29.2% pay claim. Now, given they got 22% from Wes Streeting last year, they're still demanding pay restoration. Is this a reasonable demand or something the government should resist at all costs? Will also mark the death of Norman Tebbit and the start of the state visit by President Macron. On Cross Question, former Tory MP Theo Clark, philosopher Dr Jack Symes, Labour MP Gregor Poynton and crossbench peer Baroness Claire Fox. And at 9, an hour with the former head of the British Army, Lord Richard Dannett, on his book on Korea and the current international situation.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 7.